There's no contract that says you got to play. Okay, that's the problem. It's like what do they call the conductor people that lead the? But there's three of them that usually stand on like ladders, whatever they're called. Your main one, when she was running out to the field, tripped and fell. I did laugh. I did laugh.
At least she didn't fall on like the big point that they carried.
I didn't even think about that.
Poor thing. She was running on that 50-yard line, right through the middle.
It was a run slide.
Well, I mean, this is the epitome of honor.
Oh no, it was frontal slide, like a slip and slide. She fell forward.
Well,
I don't know if Dave could
I might drop down there with you, but I probably won't.
We met like the first one we were dating. We had season tickets to one, and it was like we're sitting there, and I'm like,
13 seconds. We sat down there and was cool.
they scored 3 times in the first quarter, and I'm like texting mom. I'm like, please come pick me up. I'm like, this is horrible. And it was like 8 years in a row. It was like, and we've never been. One of these days, yes. I'll go.
guys. All right, Alan, we good to go? Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. How is everyone doing today? Good? Hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving. If you're anything like me, you're still full. What a wonderful, wonderful time of year. Hope everybody got to spend some time with loved ones and friends. That's always great. It's always best. Well, I'm excited about the new quarter as we get back into our Through the Bible in a Year. And we are beginning with the New Testament. So we finished up the Old Testament. And as we did when we went through the Old Testament, every week, if you do the notebooks, they will be out in the foyer, the new lessons, as they always are. So, and Melissa's going to have them posted, of course, on the Facebook, on the front page of the what am I thinking of? The website. Thank you very much. It's still all that turkey that's in me that I can't think clearly. So if you miss one, you can either ask me, I'll print one off for you, or you can do the PDF right off the link there on the website that says Through the Bible in a Year. Okay, well, we're talking about Matthew as we start the New Testament, so let's talk about Matthew. Between Malachi and Matthew, there's about how many years, do you know? That there's about 400. And so you have this period of silence, basically, of 400 years between the last Old Testament prophecy and then Matthew. And in those 400 years, as you can probably imagine, lots of things have changed. When we ended the Old Testament, Persia was the ancient power, the big boy on the ancient Near Eastern bloc. And then after Persia, who did power in the ancient Near East go to? It went to the Greeks. Remember Alexander the Great? And when I say remember, as though we talked about it, we haven't really talked much about that. But yeah, then Alexander the Great comes onto the scene, and suddenly Greece is the ancient power. And then after Greece, now we come up, it's the period, the New Testament period. And now who's in control of the land? The Romans. That's right, Romans are. But the official language of business is still Greek, from the influence of the Greeks. And so the New Testament is written in Greek. And so as we think about that, we shift from the Old Testament, which was written mostly in Hebrew with a few chapters here and there, like in Daniel and all, in Aramaic, but mostly all Hebrew. And then, so we've got the New Testament written in Greek. Let's talk about Matthew a little bit. His Jewish name, of course, was Levi. He was by trade, what did he do for a living? Yeah, he was a tax collector. Do you know what kind of taxes he collected by any chance? Because there's different tax, there's different tax structure, just like there is for us. And so, a lot of times we think maybe in terms of income tax or things like that, but that really was what Matthew did. The taxes, would have had a tax office in the town of Capernaum. So, and there was a major highway. And when we first started this study through the Bible in a Year, we looked at some of our maps. And you might, if you have your notebook, you can flip to the front and you can see the area of Israel. And there is a road that runs down from north to south, the Via Maris. And as it ran through Capernaum. And it connected, of course, the lands in the north like Syria and Turkey, what we would call Turkey, but Asia Minor. And then, of course, in the areas that we would call the Middle East today, it connected those with Egypt. And so anybody that went from the north to Egypt was going to pass through. And so people were taking their goods commercial goods. And so Matthew would have had a tax office set up in Capernaum, and he's going to collect these taxes, the transport taxes or toll taxes. But it's not just for people in caravans coming through, but it was also for local people. With the movement of goods, Rome's always going to get their cut. And so that's the kind of tax official that that Matthew was. He would have been an employee of Herod Antipas, who happened to be ruling Galilee at the time. He was called a tetrarch. And a tetrarch is basically kind of like a king over a particular region, kind of a smaller region. And but he wasn't sovereign. Rome was sovereign, and the Romans were. And so Antipas really basically was an employee of Rome. Matthew would have been, because of the nature of his work, he would have been a meticulous detail guy. Anybody who worked in things like Matthew in accounting and tax collector, the demands of meticulous record keeping, not everybody could do that. That's just, but he would have absolutely been a meticulous record keeper. And so as an apostle who was a meticulous record keeper, he would have been very well qualified to write about the life of Christ. How many people here have watched The Chosen by any chance? Okay, so there's several hands. People ask me a lot, would I recommend that? And the answer is yes, I do recommend it. I think it's a great series. I think it is, I think it's a very inspirational series. But one of the things, if you watch this series, Matthew's always walking around with like his notebook. And he's always taking notes. And I like how, the writers, they take some of these aspects of a personality and they kind of incorporate them like that. And, I think that's pretty fair, probably how Matthew really was. I mean, he was a meticulous record keeper. And so he would have certainly, just by his nature, I think it's pretty fair to assume that he would have been an extensive record keeper and note taker. And so he would have, as I said, been really well qualified to write about the life of Christ. He has the third longest book in the New Testament by volume. The other two, the two that are longer in terms of just by size is, and I'm not talking about chapters, I'm talking about words, is Luke and Acts. So Matthew's one of the longest books in the New Testament. And also we know that in the first couple of centuries of early church history, Matthew was the favorite gospel. Because early Christian writers, they quote Matthew, they refer to Matthew far more, for the first couple of centuries, far more than any of the other gospel writers. And so he was kind of the favorite. So that's kind of a little introduction. We're not going to talk about, a lot of times when people talk about Matthew, they talk about issues, authorship, and yada, yada, yada. We're not going to deal with any of that. No one really questions Matthew's authorship. Those are just things that kind of a lot of scholars scuffle about. But Matthew wrote it. And so as we think about and as we start talking about the first part of the New Testament, let's talk about the genre of a gospel. To really understand Matthew's gospel, we have to understand what it is and what it's not. It is a gospel, but some of the things that it's not as a gospel, it's not a congregational letter. We know what congregational letters were all about. Congregational letters, like Corinthians, those are congregational letters. Paul's letters to Timothy are written for him to take instructions to the church at Ephesus. And so the Gospels obviously aren't congregational letters. Congregational letters are written primarily to a particular congregation who's dealing with a certain situation. There's issues that have to be confronted. That's a congregational letter. A gospel is not like that at all. It's also not a complete biography. And so when we talk about gospels, we're really tempted to call them biographies. And, if someone wants to call it a biography, I'm not going to get bent out of shape by any stretch. But in the strictest sense of the word, it's not really a biography. A biography tends to be a little bit more complete. And it doesn't take long going through the Gospels to understand that it is obviously not a complete biography of Jesus. The Gospel writers, including Matthew, they do not try to include all of the details of the life of Christ. Not only Matthew, but Mark, Luke, and John all carefully choose their stories. They all have particular purposes that they want to accomplish as they write. They're wanting to say something specific about Christ and something specific about his work. And so they're going to choose a lot of these things to emphasize the point that they really want to make. And also, finally, what we can say about Matthew is it's not strictly chronological history. Now, obviously, there is, time plays a role in it because Matthew starts with the birth of Christ and ends with the death and resurrection of Christ. And so you've got those two bookends of Jesus' life. And so time obviously plays a role, but most of the time when Matthew is arranging his content, it's not really about chronology. What Matthew does is he arranges his gospel around 5 major teaching sections. A lot of times they're called the 5 discourses of Matthew. And we'll mention those in just a moment. But it is, so it's not any of those things. It's not a complete biography. It's not a congregational letter. It's not written in, strict chronology. So it is a gospel. Why is it called a gospel? Well, we don't really know why it's historically called a gospel. Maybe it's called a gospel because what you have in Mark's gospel is the very first line of Mark's gospel. Mark calls it a gospel. And maybe it's because Mark calls his a gospel, and Matthew, Mark, and John are very similar in terms of, obviously, the approach of these gospel writers, that maybe it led to later on people calling them gospels. All we know is that very early, even though the word gospel, Matthew doesn't call his book a gospel, very, very early in Christian history, it was identified as a gospel. The word gospel literally means what? What does it mean? Yeah, it means good news. And so when we think about the 4 gospels, we're talking about the 4 accounts of good news. And that's really what the gospels are. It's an account of the good news of Jesus. How he came, and what he did, and what he said, and what he accomplished through his death and resurrection. And so the word gospel really does fit it. Mark nailed it when he uses that in the very first line of his gospel. And it is one of 4, obviously. And each one of the gospel writers gives us an account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. A lot of times people, have a real spirited discussion on when it comes to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they are so similar and the content is so similar. And so all kinds of discussions, you're going to read all kinds of discussions if you're into it, about who came first. Did Matthew use Mark? Did Mark use Matthew? Did one depend on the other? And you've got scholars, man, who make a career out of discussing things like that. The fact of the matter is, we really don't know for sure how the Holy Spirit guided each of the gospel writers. We don't know. We don't know. It's hard to be 100% certain as to which gospel came first. Some people are pretty passionate about their views on which gospel came first, but it's just, you can't be 100% certain. Maybe they did depend on each other. Maybe they used a common source, and that's why there's such similarity. Maybe they did a little bit of both. We don't know any of those things for sure, but what we do know for sure, and this is the important thing to keep in mind, is that each gospel was ultimately written by the Holy Spirit. That's what we do know. And so that's what's the most important thing. Now, as I said, though, each of the gospel writers have a particular emphasis. They have a purpose in mind as they're discussing the life of Christ. And they have a little bit different emphasis. Now, what I give you here, if you use the notebook and have the sheets in front of you, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but nevertheless, maybe this will help us see some of the different emphases in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John, what is his emphasis? John's emphasis is Jesus is the Son of God. There is no genealogy in the Gospel of John. There is none. John begins, as most of you know, his Gospel by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And, then in verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then you've got the very end of John's Gospel, John chapter 20 and verse 31, where John closes the book by saying, these signs are written so that you may believe Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That is John's emphasis, that Jesus Christ is divine. From the very start, out of the gate, Jesus Christ is divine. It's John's emphasis. And then we come to Luke's emphasis. Luke's emphasis is that Jesus is the Son of Man. He is the Son of Man. Jesus' significance for all humanity is emphasized at the very beginning of Luke's gospel because he is one of two that has a genealogy, along with Matthew. And in his genealogy, which differs from Matthew, it's framed differently. You have ascending order. And so Luke is tracing the physical lineage of Jesus all the way back to Adam. Jesus is the Son of Man. Matthew begins with Abraham and then goes forward. So John emphasizes the deity of Christ. Luke emphasizes the humanity of Christ. Mark's emphasis is that Jesus is the suffering servant. That's what Mark is trying to get across. Mark doesn't give us a genealogy either. Like I said, only Luke and Matthew give genealogies. But from the very start, there is an emphasis in Mark's gospel. Jesus is a servant. Jesus is a servant. He did not come to serve, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And also in Mark's gospel, you just have a lot of highlights about the suffering that is going to come to all who follow Christ. And so Jesus is the suffering servant. And then we come to Matthew's gospel. What's Matthew all about? Matthew is all about emphasizing that Jesus is the sovereign king. He is the king. So you got John, Jesus is the Son of God, the divinity of Jesus. You've got Luke, Jesus is the Son of Man, the humanity of Jesus. Look, Mark, you've got Jesus is the suffering servant. And then Matthew, he is not only the suffering servant, he is the sovereign king. From the very beginning, Matthew makes it clear that Jesus is the king. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Matthew emphasizes he came from the line of David, for instance. He's the promised one from Abraham. And so what Matthew does in terms of his genealogy, again, he traces the legal lineage of Jesus. And that is from Jesus to Abraham. And that he didn't just come from Adam, like Luke emphasizes he came from Adam. Matthew is emphasizing he came from the line of the kings of Israel. He came from the line of the kings. He is the promised king. And so let's talk about that. Let's think about how Matthew then approaches things as he emphasizes the sovereign king. Actually, Matthew, as he's going to present Jesus, he's going to present him as the king who is revealed, and the king who is rejected, and the king who is one day going to return. That is Matthew's emphasis. And so not only does Matthew trace Jesus' lineage from the royal line, and that is from David, but you see it from the very beginning. A jealous king is pictured at the birth of Jesus. A jealous king. Who's the jealous king, by the way? Herod. Herod is the jealous king. And so, what would make a king jealous? If he felt threatened by another one who would have a claim to the throne. So, yeah. So right out of the gate, you've got the genealogy that shows that Jesus is coming from the royal line. And then you've got, his birth is a major concern to an earthly king. When he was born, the Magi came from the east, and they brought him gifts that historically are royal gifts. These are the kinds of gifts that you brought to royalty. And so there you have all of these little royal nuances in Matthew's gospel. And then, of course, you've got John the Baptist, and he's a herald. That's what kings had. Someone who goes before a king and announces that the king is coming and to prepare for the king. And so you've got John the Baptist here, and he is heralding the king. And he's also, in Matthew chapter 3 and verse 1, his message is, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So you've got this announcement, the king is here and the kingdom is at hand. And then you go over in Matthew chapter 4, and you've got Jesus. He's led into this divinely orchestrated moment of temptation. And what's one of the things that Satan promises Jesus if he just fall down and worship him? More specifically, all of the kingdoms of the world. So you have all of these royal aspects here. And then, you come to the end of Matthew chapter 4 as Jesus is beginning his ministry. And it says that Jesus went throughout all of Galilee, preaching in the synagogues and teaching about the kingdom. And so what the Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is, and people have called it this, and I think it's a good way to describe it, it is a manifesto of what life in the kingdom looks like. What does life look like? Well, this is what it looks like. If you're going to be a subject of the king, the kingdom's coming, Jesus is inviting everybody into the kingdom, and what does life in the kingdom look like? And then you've got, of course, Jesus going throughout during his earthly ministry and performing all of these miracles. These are basically, these are royal credentials that he is showing as he performs these miracles. Many of his parables are all about the mysteries of the kingdom. And then, of course, while he's facing the cross and he's predicting his future reign, he claims dominion over everything, including the angels of heaven. His last words in Matthew are that all authority has been given to him. And so you can see that the emphasis of Matthew is all about Jesus is the sovereign king. But not only does Matthew focus on Jesus is the king revealed, but also focuses uniquely on the rejection of Jesus. He's the revealed king, but he's also the rejected king. And in fact, in no other gospel, in none of the other four gospels, are Jesus' character and his claims so bitterly attacked as they are in Matthew. In fact, before Jesus was ever born, his mom was in danger at first of even being rejected by Joseph. You got these pictures of rejection even from the very beginning, and it was only through a divine message that Joseph then understood that everything was okay. But then, of course, soon after he's born, Herod threatens his life. His parents have to flee to Egypt. You just continue to see all of this, all of these rejections. His herald, John the Baptist, tossed in a dungeon, ultimately beheaded. All throughout his earthly ministry, Jesus is saying, I don't have any place to lay my head. That is, I don't have any place to call home. That's a sign of rejection. There is no, unlike Luke 23 in Matthew's gospel, there is no penitent thief acknowledging his lordship. There's no loved ones seen at the foot of his cross in Matthew's gospel. The only ones seen in Matthew's gospel are mockers and scoffers. Even the women in Matthew's gospel are pictured at a distance. And in Matthew's gospel, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? So Matthew really emphasizes not only Jesus is the revealed king, but he's also really emphasizes his rejection as the king. It's only a Gentile centurion at the end there at the cross who speaks a favorable word about Christ when he says, this was truly the Son of God. And then, even though Jesus is presented by Matthew as the sovereign king who is revealed, who is rejected, even though he's rejected, Matthew is also going to emphasize, show him as the king who is ultimately, despite the fact that he's rejected, he is sovereign, and so he will ultimately return one day, and he is going to judge, and he is going to rule. One day, the entire earth will see the glory of the coming of Jesus Christ in power. And as Jesus is going to say in Matthew chapter 24, verse 44, it's going to be an hour when you do not think that he's going to come. And when he does come, it is going to be in glory and in judgment. So that's basically how the approach, the emphasis of Matthew's gospel. Now, as far as the structure of Matthew, let me return to something that I said earlier. And that is the most obvious feature of Matthew's structure is how it focuses on Jesus' teaching, what he taught. Matthew contains 5 major speeches that he develops everything around. And they're listed here in bullet points. You have the Sermon on the Mount. That's the first major discourse in Matthew's Gospel, 5 through 7. The sending out of the 12 in chapter 10 is the second major discourse, the second long speech. Chapter 13 is basically the parables of the kingdom. And then you've got chapter 18 where he's talking about basically community life, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And then you've got his discourse, the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25, which is teaching about the end of the age. And so that's kind of how Matthew groups the content. Like I said, Matthew really focuses on what Jesus taught. In fact, the reality is there's 1,071 verses in Matthew's gospel, and 60% of those, a full 60%, contain the spoken words of Christ. And so, again, when it comes to what Jesus taught, Matthew contains the most complete record of Jesus' teaching during his ministry here. Just a couple of special features, just some interesting facts about Matthew's gospel. Matthew quotes the Old Testament more than any of the other gospels. At least 57 times he quotes the Old Testament. Mark is the one who quotes the next most, has the next most quotations from the Old Testament, and he has 30 quotes. So Matthew about doubles Mark's quotations from the Old Testament. Also, Matthew is the only gospel to use the word church. Where are the 2 places that Matthew uses the word church? Does anybody know off the top of your head? Matthew 16, absolutely. Upon this rock I will build my church. Does anybody remember the next one? Matthew chapter 18. This is all about community life. And so it shouldn't surprise us then as he talks about the kingdom community that's going to be the context of the other use of the word ecclesia. Chapter 18 in verse 17, where Jesus is talking about discipline of someone's if your brother sins, go and show him. If he listens, you've won your brother. If he doesn't listen, take one or two with you, so that by the mouth of two or three witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And so those are the two instances. And the only gospel writer who actually uses the word church in the gospel. Matthew records 10 parables that are not recorded in other gospels and 3 miracles that are not recorded elsewhere. So Matthew does have, even though there's a lot of similarity in content, of course, with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are certainly some unique aspects of it. Also, another important aspect of Matthew's gospel, a unique aspect of it, is that he uses the expression kingdom of heaven. The other gospel writers don't say kingdom of heaven. The other gospel writers say kingdom of God. Now, that's one of the things, when Matthew calls it the kingdom of heaven, that's one of the things that emphasize, that show that the primary audience of Matthew's original audience was Jewish. There's several things that I won't bother getting into that show that Matthew's original audience was originally a strongly Jewish audience. Now, why would that show kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God? Why would kingdom of heaven show that it's mainly Jewish a lot of time? Does anybody know? That's right. That's right. The Jews did not speak the name of God. If there was the divine name, the Yahweh, they would, the Jews would say the Lord. They don't even write the divine name, and so they just and so they substitute heaven a lot, the kingdom of heaven, and that also shows us the word heaven is used in various ways in the Bible and in the New Testament, and one is essentially a synonym for God. That's why we read kingdom of heaven. What's it mean? It means kingdom of God. Because God and heaven are so closely associated. That's why, you'll read about a person who sins against heaven. Well, that means they sinned against God. I ask you, whose teaching is this from? Is it from heaven or from man? In other words, is it from God or from man? And so it often uses a synonym for heaven, and Matthew uses it that way, kingdom of heaven. So those are some of the features, the special features of Matthew's gospel. When it comes to lessons from Matthew, as we get ready here in our last 10 minutes, man, it's always tough, especially when you're trying to find lessons in the Gospels, because there's so many. I mean, every text there's an emphasis. And so I've narrowed it down to this. Since it's really about Christ as King, and the emphasis, so many of the parables are about kingdom mysteries, I think it's fair to kind of describe the content and the lessons from a kingdom perspective. And first of all, you have the kingdom. So I've got 4 bullet statements here. The first one is, one of the lessons from Matthew is we learn about the kingdom lifestyle. The kingdom lifestyle. And again, I mentioned the Sermon on the Mount is about what life in the kingdom looks like. It was different than a lot of the Jews had come to understand. Jesus, you've heard it said that, when you divorce your wife, make sure you get the paperwork right. And Jesus is saying, but I'm saying to you, and you stay married. You've heard it said, and so he goes through all of these things, and so it's a lifestyle. And so he said, this is what life in the kingdom looks like. If you want to be a subject of the king, kingdom living has a lifestyle. And there in the Sermon on the Mount, you read things like Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees. Theirs was kind of an external righteousness. Jesus is, no. Righteousness is inside and out. Inside out. So kingdom lifestyle is huge. Lessons from Matthew. Then you've got the second lesson here is Matthew's emphasis is on kingdom mission. The kingdom mission. He really emphasizes the mission of the kingdom. What is the mission of the kingdom? What is our mission? Glorify God and share Jesus with others. That's exactly right. And let me kind of put a special emphasis here on sharing Jesus with others. You'll see so much, even though the primary audience of Matthew is a Jewish audience, you will find such a universal emphasis in Matthew's gospel. Just a huge universal. In Matthew chapter 8, you've got a Roman centurion, and Jesus is like, nobody in Israel has this kind of faith. As a Roman. And then you've got in Matthew chapter 15, you've got a Canaanite woman. Matthew's the only one. You don't ever read about Canaanites in the New Testament. I mean, they're all over the pages of the Old Testament, but not in the New Testament. But the Canaanite woman, why does Matthew call her a Canaanite? I don't know, but I think probably part of it is to just accentuate that there is a huge gulf that exists between Jesus and this woman, not only religiously, but ethnically and every other way. And what's that account all about? It is about, she shows you what great faith is. Oh, woman, great is your faith. Jesus is so tired of seeing all the superficial faith among followers. And he just keeps throwing obstacles in her path, and she just keeps climbing over them. And he said, that's what it's about. Jesus is showing us what great faith looks like, and it's from a Gentile. Obviously, you've got, when you think of the universal mission of the kingdom, what passage comes to mind? In Matthew's gospel. Yeah, the Great Commission. Go into all the world. Go make disciples and, of all the nations. Baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. You've got in Matthew chapter 4, before the Sermon on the Mount, the ministry of Christ launches, you've got this quote about light dawning in Galilee. The light has dawned and the term that is used there is the Galilee of the Gentiles. And so over and over again, you've got an emphasis on the universal nature of the kingdom's mission. Matthew 21, a parable that talks about basically God's going to take it away from the Jews for the rejection, give it to another, the Gentiles. So, kingdom mission. The next one, bullet statement number 3, the third lesson is kingdom community. Kingdom community. We learn from Matthew's gospel that there is a community. There's a community of faith. And there's responsibilities within the community of faith. There's relationships within the community of faith. And we just looked at Matthew 18 where Jesus talks about, then you go tell it to the church. So he's talking about, how do we deal with those who drift or who sin against others? That instruction's here in Matthew's gospel. And so you've got a lifestyle, kingdom lifestyle, Matthew emphasizes. You're to be salt and light. You're to be conspicuously different in how you live. And if you're not conspicuously different, you're not good for anything but to be tossed out. You've got a kingdom mission. Jesus came, and he came because he came for the world. He came for everyone. Now, you're in a community in the kingdom, and you have responsibilities to help one another and encourage one another and to relate to one another and discipline one another if necessary. So kingdom community. And then the last thing that we find a strong emphasis on Matthew is the kingdom future. So kingdom lifestyle, kingdom mission, kingdom community, and kingdom future. Matthew's emphasis is, listen, don't get complacent. Don't get complacent. That's what Matthew 24 and 25 are all about. What are going to be the signs of your coming again and the end of the age? And there, down in verse 36 of Matthew chapter 24, of that time, hour and time, day and time, nobody knows. It's going to happen like a thief in the night. It's going to happen like a thief in the night. And so be prepared. And then he gives those three parables, you know, the unjust servant who the master goes away and he says, oh, I'll beat my fellow slaves. And the master's going to come back when he doesn't reckon. No, it's going to happen. And then it's going to be bad. And then you've got, you know, the parable of the 10 virgins. What's that about? Be ready. You don't know when the bridegroom's coming. And then, of course, you've got the talents. What's that about? God has left us with responsibilities while he's away. And when he comes back, he expects us to be what he left us to be and be prepared. So don't get complacent. So the kingdom future. So that's Matthew's emphasis. Okay. We got about 2 minutes. Any questions, comments, observations on that quick summary of Matthew's gospel? Yes, Ron. Yeah. A lot of people have their favorite gospels for that. And my favorite is Matthew. And I think it really, because since it's all built around the teaching of Christ so much, his words, all those major discourses, it's so suitable when you're helping people to understand, okay, you want to be in the kingdom? What does that mean? Well, let's take a look at what it means. This is the lifestyle. And, you work through. So, yeah, I see why you guys would use it so much in a setting like that. Yes, sir. Absolutely. He is Messiah King. Amen. He is the Messiah King. He is the sovereign King. Yes. Anything else before we go? Okay, well, listen, thank you very much. Next week, it is Mark. Have a wonderful rest of the day. And Lord willing, I'll see you tonight at 6 o'clock. Go home and eat some leftovers.